Right, good afternoon. After an excellent lunch, it falls to me to chair this panel. Now, I am conscious that we are preceded not only by lunch, but also by a weight of authority from the most distinguished panel which begin, but I hope this panel might be termed the Rising Stars. Also, we all have bicycles, which is an interesting combination.
Stars on bikes.
Yeah, stars on bikes, indeed. So we may not be heavyweight in physique, but one hopes we are developing a certain weightiness in brain power. So we have Fiona Donson from the University of Cork, who is going to kick off on the subject of student engagement. She'll be followed by, on my left, David Mead from East Anglia, who is going to talk about various experiments he has tried in teaching, and he'll tell us what worked and what didn't. Then we have Mark Elliott from Cambridge, who's going to talk about topicality. We've had allusions to topicality in the first session, so Mark is going to, I hope, develop that. And finally, Richard Kirkham on the end is going to talk about new media for teaching. I have asked them all to stick to 10 minutes. I hope I won't need to carry out my threat if anybody starts to run seriously over of emptying a jug of water over their heads. But if we can manage to stick to the allotted time, then we will have plenty of time for an interesting discussion. And given the discussion at the previous panel, it's clear everybody has lots to say. So, Fiona.
Thank you. So, student engagement. I'm trying to try really hard not to be the grumpy person on the panel and engage myself with all those students aren't any good anymore and they don't want to listen anymore. Because I think we've all had those conversations, or at least coming on the back of exam boards, where with our first year, I shouldn't say exactly the percentage that failed at least one of those subjects, but we've had a particularly bad year. And our exam board broke out into an engagement with, well, students today, they just don't want to learn, do they? And I think it's very easy for us to do that on the topic of student engagement, that somehow the students today are much worse than they used to be, or it's much more difficult to teach them. And obviously it's much more difficult than that. So, as I say, I want to try and be a little positive, but I'm probably going to start with some negative as well. But I think it's also important for us to think about expectations of students and also our own expectations, because it is, as I say, easy to kind of break students down into one. You know, we think they're one homogenous group, and we think that they don't want to engage. They just want to pass the exams. They want that kind of, they want the answer and they want to succeed. Of course they do. They want to succeed. Why else would they be there? But it's a lot more complicated than that. So if you can think yourselves back a minute to when you were in constitutional administrative law, you know, we are not a normal group. Our sense of what student engagement should be like comes from the fact that we're teaching this subject. Most of us are teaching it because we love it, and we probably actually loved it when we studied it. No matter who taught it to us, it engaged something in us that we recognised and kind of wanted to learn. What we know, though, is that, and we've already heard this morning, that many of our students aren't engaged like that. They may be 18, they may be 19, some are from other jurisdictions. They come to their constitutional and administrative, their public law classes with very little knowledge of the subject. They come with already preconceived ideas of what law should be, so it should be cases, it should be answers, it should be straightforward, it should be linear somehow. And they're faced with a public law course which is none of that. It's all the things that the delegates this morning were talking about. It's history, it's politics, it's even economics, it's psychology, it's international law, it's local law. But it's largely not about cases until they get through to kind of human rights or judicial review. If it's the human rights cases, that's great. They usually love that. If it's the judicial review cases, then we're in a whole different ballgame, and I'll talk about administrative law in a minute. It's also about statute, Now, that should be good for them, but actually students hate statutes. Even though there's a degree of certainty to statutes and the black letter law that they think they love, they hate statutes. They don't want to read a statute, which is what they need to do in much of the kind of public law subjects. They positively resist that. And then there are the history and the stories and we get into the soft law, the regulations, the kind of law that they don't normally do elsewhere in their degrees. And they have to think about remedies as well. So there's so much going on that I think there's a real difficulty in getting them to think. Now, I have a luxury of teaching. I teach administrative law rather than constitutional law, I should have guessed from my comment this morning. And administrative law has particular challenges to it because most students have no knowledge of the regulatory state. If they're 18 or 19, the nearest they get is the student loan system, which is largely private, as I understand the system here. In Ireland, it's a public system and it's a basket case of a system, but they still don't get it. I teach evening law, though, to mature students who largely work in the public sector, and it's an absolute joy. They come into the classroom, they want to learn, they ask questions, they have their own experiences of the subject, and that's where you get that engagement straight away. And the challenge for us is to try and introduce our day students, our 18, 19-year-olds, to what's good about administrative law, constitutional law, what's easily accessible. We can do it for most of them, not all of them, and we just need to find a way, and I think as part of our teaching, and what the rest of the panel is going to talk about, is ways of things using like topicality, current issues, of getting them over that initial threshold of understanding what this subject is about. Once you get them there, you can actually start to lay the different elements to it. So it's that sense. I think it's too easy for us to just say that students aren't engaged today. The other thing is that many of our students, it's expensive to go to university today. Many of them are running jobs, have families. Our students are not just 18. They have other things that they do with their lives. And so if students aren't present in class, it may not be that they're disengaged. It may be that they have to be somewhere else at the time of which the class is going on. So there's also issues, I think, of alternative ways of reaching students and alternative methods of getting to them. So that's a very long introduction, I think, in terms of our expectations of what students should, what an engaged student should be. The other thing is their expectations, because as I say, they like black letter law. They expect law to be linear, straightforward. Public law is a mass of different things that fit together in a web or kind of crazy jigsaw. That's very complicated for them. They have to try and find the through lines, and we have to kind of give them kind of this idea of these through lines, the way in which it kind of somehow matches up. But we also have to get them comfortable with uncertainty. We had words this morning like mystique or abstract, the abstract nature. But law is, and this is not new to, particular to public law is fundamentally uncertain. They want certainty, we're giving them uncertainty. They want the right answer, we tell them there isn't one. That's not a comfortable message for them to hear. It's not easy to. What we have to do is give them the skills to work with that uncertainty and to be comfortable themselves with that uncertainty, which is what we love, let's be honest. We like the fact that we can sit in a room and argue over one particular line from a case for 3 hours at an end and still not agree at the end of it. Students don't want to hear that. They want to find some kind of way of recognizing the way forward. So and that's, as I say, that's not just a public law issue, but I think it's particularly difficult in public law because of their lack of background knowledge and their lack of hooks. When I teach criminal law to first years, they love it. They love me by the end of it because I basically take them through dead bodies for 12 weeks. And they think that that's fabulous. Endless cases around death and destruction for them is the greatest thing that they can think of. And their images that come to mind when they come into the first class is things like Law and Order and Criminal Minds. They see the news. In administrative law, the only thing that I could come up with was the BBC Two series, The Planners, which had the tagline, an 8-part observational documentary series following planning applications and the contentious processes behind them. I had thought of possibly starting my admin law class with the opening episode of that to see if I could engage them. I know, it's not going to work. But that's about kind of taking something that they think is dry and revealing it to them as something that isn't dry. But I think we also have reputational problems for some subjects, that some subjects are regarded as being particularly troublesome. And I think that's certainly around kind of the judicial review side and the administrative side of things, that that's seen as being dry, heavy, difficult, hard to grasp. The other thing that I want to then raise then is question around assessments. Because again, students have expectations of what their assessment should be. They want to get to the end of their course, they want to pass their course, sit what would normally be an exam, and come out the other end. And here we are as students who want, as teachers who want to actively engage our students. We want active students, not passive students. We want students who own their teaching. You can tell I've done one of those teaching and learning courses. We want them to own their learning process and really engage with it. And we can do that to some extent through our teaching techniques, but it becomes a challenge with assessments, I think, as to how we really integrate this kind of more active learning and getting them to kind of move beyond a surface regurgitation, which to some extent schooling kind of indoctrinates them into something that's much more about rational thought and problem solving and getting them to tease out the ideas beyond the, I can regurgitate this particular case. So I'm just going to throw out there, I don't have any answers on assessment techniques, but I kind of want to kind of raise that. I think it's very important that we discuss it. We have a tendency historically to rely on exams. Students like exams, they hate them, but they like them because they are they're a one-point process. They kind of work to it, they sit them, and they come out the other end. We like them because they are relatively straightforward. We set the essay questions and problem questions. And that, what we've moved to in more recent times, of course, is essays, the different kinds of assessments. The difficulties there is overloading students. We certainly see difficulties of students having layer upon layer upon layer of written assessment during the year. Certainly first term, we've got students who have 10 probably written assignments during a 12-week period, most of which are set in the last 6 weeks of the assessment. That's incredibly difficult for them, particularly first and second years, to be juggling that weight of assessment and to trying to really actively engage with their learning and then kind of engage with possibly challenging assessment processes. I'm going to finish in very quickly. So that the key thing I want us to ask there then is this. Problem questions. We think problem questions are particularly valuable, particularly around judicial review. I always include problem questions in my exams. My students try and avoid them like the plague because they know how difficult it is. The question I want to ask, and I don't have a particular answer to, is why do we think that they're particularly good, and are they particularly good and useful? The second thing is alternative types of essays, something beyond the traditional and normal. I teach an administrative kind of institutional course, the administrative state course, and I tend to set questions which include things like briefing notes, write a briefing note on something, engage them in different approaches to reasoning rather than just here is your essay question, but actually think about structure, think about different type of discussion. The students hate it. They positively resist anything that's outside the norm. And that goes to the question, I think, my final point of skill integration. Because part of the reason I do it is I want to expose them to different types of skill development within their assessment, not just around public law, but around their legal education generally, and different ways, whether it be group learning, whether it be thinking about different engagement in the writing process. The fact that the students hate it, I regard as positive, because I think it's about challenging them. But I kind of I think I'd be really interested in hearing other efforts or other ways of kind of pursuing that skill development within a kind of public law context. Thank you. I'm sorry.
That's okay, Fiona. I did think David was going to approach you with the jug, but he was just pouring out a glass for himself. Right, so without further ado, Fiona has alluded to some experiments she's tried. I think the briefing note is quite an interesting idea. David is going to go into the subject of experiments in a rather more detail.
Thank you, and thank you all for coming along. I've got 4 or 5 things that I've tried out as the module organiser for constitutional and admin law at UEA. I had the support of a very good director of learning and teaching who was also me, so I just sort of signed everything off and let myself get on with it, basically. I don't know whether any of these is unique. I suspect they're not, so I'm just simply throwing them out for discussion and consideration. So apologies to any grandmothers in the room who want to be sucking eggs. This is perhaps a little bit trite, but we'll see where we get to. A couple are, I suppose, broadly under the canvas of promoting students' interest and engagement. Whether they succeed, I have no idea, really. One is very clearly skills-based, and the other is a new form of assessment. In no particular order, we tried problem-based learning at UEA for 2 years in the early 2000s. Perhaps you can get to the end of the story, we only tried it for 2 years. So for those unfamiliar, I mean, this is not setting problems in tutorials. This is supposed to be much more student-focused, where they work through they effectively they don't construct the problem, but they construct the solution. So you present them. This is the judicial review / human rights bit of the course after Christmas. So they are in small groups. They work in a small group. We had them over 4-week periods. We met them 3 times in those 4 weeks. In one of the weeks, they were effectively working by themselves. In the first week, you present them with a problem. They're in their small groups, and they thresh around what they think might be some of the things they need to investigate. At the end of the class, you come up with an agenda for each group or for the whole group of the things they need to go away and find out for themselves. They go away. An awful lot of online discussion takes place, either through me or through the groups. We meet, perhaps more contortions are thrown into the problem, and then sort of in the 4th week they either I think they presented it as a moot, but they may have just presented it as a class problem. We ran it for 2 years only. We were beset, I think, by a series of problems that is, I think, both specific to public law but also institutional. The specific problem for public law is we couldn't conceive of a way to teach it for the institutions and principles bit of the course, so we landed it on them in January, and they were quite used to being taught sorry, I ought to say, there are fewer lectures. The lectures are much more of a support and a prompt than providing the sort of the panoply of information that perhaps lectures would normally do. So we'd withdrawn that support at Christmas and basically, now you've got to go off and fend for yourselves. And understandably, they were a bit cross. We were doing it in isolation. So, I mean, unlike other schools, York, where that is part of the teaching ethos, criminal law and land law were both taught at UEA in the first year, but neither of those two decided that they would go along with us. So, again, the students were saying, well, why don't you just teach us? We're being taught in land law. It's fine for them. What is so special about public law? So it was met with a lot of resistance from students. There were fewer problems of free riding than we had envisaged, but there was still some free riding. And I think the other problem, perhaps, that we had was that there is not the range of problems, perhaps, that you can construct in public law. I mean, there's judicial review. It's got 3 heads of review, and that's what you find out. In criminal law, there are sort of alternative I don't know enough about criminal law, but one can imagine in private law obligations and in criminal law that it would be easier to construct a problem for the students to do that would have perhaps some dead ends or an awful lot more investigation on their part. So I throw that out as a possibility, but we tried it and we gave up with it. The second is an assessment, which is for the last 2 or 3 years at UEA, 2 years I think, we have had as part of the summative assessment multiple choice test, MCQs. It comprises, I think, 25%, it might be 30% of the overall assessment. The rest is either exam or a piece of coursework. So there is a major piece of work that is not the multiple choice. I decided I would go, if anybody is interested, I have put some photocopies over on the desk there. My worry at the start was constructing an exam that would be sufficiently rigorous. There was understandably resistance institutionally. I had a very supportive external examiner, Mike Palmer from SOAS, who was quite happy with both the proposal and with the exam paper. It was very time-consuming. I don't know whether anyone has ever tried to do multiple choice with it. It took me about 2 or 3 days, I think, to construct 40 questions. I did a range of questions, as you will see if anybody takes them, of ranges of difficulty. I had some questions on topical issues, so it was made clear to the students at the start of the year that there would be questions in the multiple choice on political events that had taken place, so there were 4 or 5 of those. There were 4 or 5 questions on the wider reading that they had been given. So one of the questions had asked, one of the readings during the year was looking at Kalatowski's article, I think in Parliamentary Affairs, on the legislative process and the inputs into the legislative process. And they'd been asked to read that, very few had done, but there was a question on the multiple choice asking for their views on what point she was trying to make. So there were some very simple questions on the paper. We still had students managing only to get 25 or 30%, and I had calculated that there were 45% worth of easy questions, so they had failed even to do the easy questions. We did have a student with 95%, which obviously was a very good. One of the questions was on what is a Leviathan, one was on the Grundnorm, and others were on all sorts of other things. And I had set, I thought, well, some are going to get 80, but I have to say I was absolutely amazed that somebody, I mean, maybe you would not be, but I was amazed that somebody got 95. They've basically got one question wrong. Now, they may have had a guess on them, I don't know. But it was, I think, a reasonably tricky paper. There were more students getting 70s and 80s. As I say, we compensated by it only being a percentage of the overall assessment. And we have tried it and we've continued with it. We did it specifically so that we could test knowledge and understanding as an objective of the course. What is their core understanding? And then the exam or the coursework was testing application, ability to argue, et cetera, et cetera. And a couple of last points, I'm aware of the time. I also devised, and this was very time-consuming, I think this is probably quite rare. The best description I have of them are on-the-shoulder podcasts. The problem I was trying to solve was we asked students to do an awful lot of research, we asked them to do an awful lot of reading of articles, but it is very hard, impossible in a room of 200, very hard in a group of 12 to 16, actually to teach them those skills. So we might ask them to do some research and they have the product and they discuss the product in class. And I thought the problem was, or if they could sit on my shoulder and watch me do the sorts of things that I do every day, some of them might be a little better informed. So I devised 3 or 4. 2 of them were research. I got the inspiration from a colleague who was doing an Open University degree. So basically you set a series of exercises, you get them to pause the podcast, and at the end of the pause, you give them the explanation of how I would have gone about this by doing X and Y. So one of them was on using the Parliament website, asking to find the dates, what can you find an amendment put forward by Lord X on day Y? What about the explanatory notes, those sorts of things? Some basic research on Westlaw. And then another one was on looking at some articles. Nick Bamforth's article in Public Law on David Blunkett's resignation, and an article, one of Diana Woodhouse's articles on ministerial responsibility, role responsibility. And the task there was, could they summarise it and get some salient points? And I said, well, I would have been noting this, 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 and this. So again, it was my way, I suppose, of trying to get them to do the sorts of things that we tend to take for granted, but I suspect we rarely ever teach. That was very labour-intensive, but I hope worthwhile. I didn't get a great deal of feedback from the students, very, very vexingly. And then the last point, in the last minute, I think I have, just to take up a point that Mark is going to be making on topicality. We introduced and ran for a good many years until we redevised the syllabus, what we called case study lectures. So we took a case and we analysed it in a lecture in detail. And this is, I suspect is done by large numbers of people. We did it for two reasons. Again, the first was so that they would have a grounding in case law analysis. So we did an awful lot on the reasoning of the judgment. So we had the Belmarsh case, Mendoza, and Jackson, and a colleague then did the Hutton inquiry. Obviously not a case analysis, but looking at something in a bit more depth. So partly to teach them or to introduce them to the skills of legal analysis, and partly, which we were trying to do in the hour-long lecture, to look at the material in context and to use it as a teaching tool to wider issues about judicial review, deference, if we're looking at Belmarsh, or the role of human rights and all of those sorts of things, say, with Mendoza. And we ran those. In fact, we still run those, but in a slightly different way. I suppose the problem with those is if you're a lazy lecturer like me, you use the same one for a good few years. If you're a better lecturer than I would be, you would be updating those on a weekly, monthly, hourly basis. If you've got the time, fantastic. If you haven't, you trot out the same one year in, year out. I'll finish there.
Right, well, thank you. Now we have Mark, who is going to take up very neatly from where David has left off on the subject of topicality.
Thank you. Well, we talked a little bit this morning about the extent to which public law is distinctive or not. I think it is distinctive as a legal discipline, and I think that students perceive that it's distinctive in pedagogical terms. Certainly, I think that students become very quickly accustomed to what they might regard as the black letter paradigm of subjects like tort and crime, and they find the more abstract institutional conceptual sides of public law to be quite disorientating, I think. What I want to look at is the way in which we might harness another distinctive feature of public law, namely its topicality, as a means by which to overcome some of those difficulties that I think students tend to have with the subject. I should add the health warning that this is a case of do as I say, not as I do. I think going back to the conservatism that was mentioned this morning, these are ideas that I haven't really tested out to any great extent in my own teaching, but we may do more of this in the future. So I want to look at three things. What do I mean by topicality in the first place? Secondly, should we regard this as a blessing or a curse? And thirdly, how do we ensure that it's the former in our treatment of the subject? So what I mean by topicality is that things happen in public law to an extent which goes beyond regular academic discourse and which goes beyond the senses in which other subjects would tend to evolve. Of course, almost any area of legal study is topical in the sense that new laws are enacted, cases are decided, government policy changes, things happen. But I think that public law is unusually topical in three ways which are relevant to how the subject is taught and how students might either successfully or unsuccessfully engage with it. So the first point simply concerns the volume of material and the volume of developments with which public lawyers have to, or might feel they have to, cope. The amount of case law, it seems, is considerable and growing and is much greater than that which was experienced 20, 30, 40 years ago. Public law accounts now for a very significant percentage of the cases decided at the highest judicial level. And I think public lawyers have to keep abreast of an especially wide range of developments, spanning both domestic and European case law, as well as literature, legislation, and a huge amount of official publications. The second sense in which the subject is particularly topical has to do with the speed at which it changes, often in quite fundamental respects. So we can think about particular turning points like the Human Rights Act, the Constitutional Reform Act, and so on. It might be going too far to say that public law has changed beyond recognition in the last 20 years, but it has been transformed to quite a significant degree. And in that sense, it seems to me that public law is susceptible to shocks and to very significant and rapid changes in a way that at least some other areas of law may not be. And thirdly, public law and the issues it grapples with have a particularly, and I suppose unsurprising because the clue is in the title, public profile, which gives the subject an obvious topicality. So public law and the matters it impinges on are the subjects of media attention and public discourse in a way that isn't true of every other area of legal study. Well, law applicants, certainly at Cambridge when we interview them, are very fond of telling their interviewers that law is interesting because it is ubiquitous, because they find the law everywhere. And if that's true, then public law must be especially interesting because its ubiquity is there to be seen. But topicality can be a double-edged sword, I think. It can be either a blessing or a curse. And which of those things it turns out to be turns to a large extent on how those of us who curate the subject, whether as lecturers or tutors or textbook writers, choose to present and select the material that's available. So the different senses of topicality which I've sketched create some obvious risks, I think. The sheer number of developments in public law, coupled with very ready access to the information about them through the internet, social media, and so on, may easily become overwhelming. And a firm grasp of the basic foundational principles may be sacrificed in favour of the latest case, the latest select committee report, or blog post, or tweet. And I said that as an enthusiastic blogger and tweeter myself. So the trees may begin to obscure the wood. On the other hand, from a teaching perspective, I think that topicality is potentially one of public law's greatest strengths. It establishes its credentials as a dynamic, evolving, relevant area of law, which is not just the subject of academic discourse, but also the subject of public and very high-profile public debate. So in that sense, public law's topicality is something which can be harnessed to draw students in and hopefully to keep them there. Certainly I've noticed that my own students' interest levels rise when we start to talk about how the principles that they've studied relate to and interact with interesting things that are going on, whether that's a speech by the Home Secretary threatening to repeal the Human Rights Act, or attempts to deport foreign terror suspects, etc., etc. But certainly the students' interest levels markedly rise as soon as you start to relate what they're doing to those kinds of current issues. So how can we try to ensure that topicality fulfills its promise as a blessing and doesn't become a burden to us? I think that in considering that, it's helpful to distinguish two different senses in which material can be topical. The first and obvious possibility is that the material is topical in the sense that it is evidence of or constitutive of a change in the law itself, or of the wider context in which law has to be understood. Now, the cult of the latest case and the connected phenomenon of the reading list that only ever gets longer from year to year are not unique to public law. But I do think that our area is maybe particularly susceptible, along with some others, to that kind of risk. The more that there is going on, and the easier it is to point students to information about what's going on, the more important it is that we, who teach the subject, act as effective curators of the material that's out there. Now, I'm not arguing that we should try to shield our students from the richness and the diversity and the complexity of what's happening in the world of public law. But I do think that we have a duty to ensure that our students' attention is focused on developments that really matter, rather than elevating and placing on a pedestal every latest thing that happens. So, in other words, less can sometimes be more. And I think that in a first-year subject, that's particularly true. The second sense in which material might be topical is that rather than constituting change in itself, it may demonstrate or facilitate engagement with key concepts or principles or problems. This kind of illustrative topicality, I think, holds real potential as a pedagogical tool. Now, of course, we all use examples in our teaching, and it would be odd to pass over examples in what we do. But it occurs to me that reliance on material of this nature might go further, or it might at least go further than it does in my own teaching at present. It might even move centre stage, I think, but I haven't got a worked out design of what this would look like. I think that you could design a public law course which was organised around a handful of well-chosen examples, which would then be a vehicle for the exploration of key issues and principles. Now, of course, that then begins to intersect with a whole range of other questions about contextualism, about breadth versus depth, and about mastery of the technical detail versus conceptual understanding. And this also raises yet another of what I would think of as public law's distinctive characteristics, that it has multiple and perhaps no obvious points of entry, and that it's particularly difficult to break it down into bite-sized chunks, which is, of course, what students would really like us to do. Because of that, it seems to me that case studies, themes, topical examples supply ways of navigating public law that, rather than seeking to disguise or marginalise, actually harness the essential nature of the subject as a web of overlapping ideas, relational institutions, and interlocking and often contradictory principles. So I'm not entirely certain yet where this thinking leads, if anywhere, but what I think it leads away from is the traditional linear course, which risks imposing an artificial structure which may be an obstacle to understanding the interconnectedness of the different parts of the subject. And so in that sense, I think the discrete question about how we might better integrate topicality into our teaching is simply a facet of a much wider set of questions about how best to teach public law today. Thank you.
Oh, Richard.
Like David this morning, I feel like I should start with a confession that it's ironic that I'm doing new media, being as I don't have a television at the moment. I only got the internet in my house a couple of years ago, and I've only got that because it's got a rather groovy cycling app which I can use to monitor my cycle rides. But I do believe in new media, and we try and use a lot of it in our teaching and the way that we've set up our course. And it kind of links in with the topicality theme, I think, very, very neatly, as it's a way to really sort of get the topicality message driven home to the students and makes the course accessible. And also kind of links into the question which I raised this morning. I'm converted more to the idea that you have to adopt a very different approach to teaching a level 1 student, which we're often obliged to do in public law, as opposed to what you would do with level 3. And I'm increasingly trying to boost the optional modules in public law, because you can perhaps explore a more challenging kind of syllabus at that level. Whereas I think for level 1, we are obliged to take on board the A-level student that's transferring to our kind of discipline and our new way of learning, and get them interested and engaged. So that's my sort of background philosophy, I suppose, to all this. But I don't think this necessarily means dumbing down, because if we've heard a lot less is more going on, and I totally agree. Because if we can focus down on a few issues and tackle them in more depth and get students integrated through using the likes of blogs, I think that's an exciting way of getting them involved and arguing and participating, which I find perhaps the biggest challenge of teaching the level 1 courses. One problem with the new media stuff is that there is now such a range of different things which you can use, and you then get the next problem of overload of material. So you've got to try to find a sort of way of challenging the variety of different material you can use, plus of course the old-fashioned textbook stuff. I was comforted to hear Robert this morning acknowledge that the textbook way of teaching is only sort of part of the process. And I think that's right, because I do wonder with the new media, well, the role of the textbook becomes slightly different. I find it not just a sort of comfort blanket for the students, but a comfort blanket for me, as inevitably I cannot cover everything in the lectures. I can always fall back on the textbook. But if we have if we use a variety of different resources through new media, I think we need to be very careful about how we manage it and present the package to the students. And certainly, I suspect I'm not alone in this room that spent an awful lot of time setting up a website for our course, which has got piles of information, and the next challenge is to try and package that information in a way which all the students can understand and manage. But I think the effort's worthwhile because it allows us to guide the students through the course in a more clear, transparent way. As to what different options that there are to use, again, there's a danger of teaching grandmothers to suck eggs and all the rest of it. So we make quite a lot of use in our department of briefing notes to try and explain and rationalise the choices that we have made, the selectivity that we've actually had to pursue in designing our public law course and how it differs from the textbooks. And that allows us, of course, to use hyperlinks, which raises another issue, the business of whether you should be encouraging searching skills and all the rest of it, whereas I actually at a level 1 try and make it as easy as I can for the students to access the material. But I take the view that that's okay because my number one goal is to get the students engaged and accessing the materials, and I assume they'll get the searching skills throughout the degree. Of course, big advantage of that is that we can, much more than when I was a student, get them straight to primary resources. We can get them using parliamentary papers, get them watching select committee hearings. So that's consultation papers. We can direct students straight to them, and that's how I try and do it. We also at our place we record all our lectures and put that up on the web as well. We're not afraid of doing that. And I have to say, we've only been doing it for a year, but that hasn't led to a marked reduction in lecture attendance, so that's quite comforting. So we've gone through for that. There is a danger, of course, that I have at least 1 or 2 lectures a year when I'm not up to standard, but I'm not worried about that because I've long worked out that I'm going to have to have a follow-up compensation lecture. In my case, I quite often put up screencasts up on the website as well to sort of fill the gaps that haven't always been delivered. Other things that we've experimented with are podcasts. I sort of had a weekly magazine programme for a couple of years. I'm not quite sure how successful that was. The only danger was it took quite a lot of work to keep it up to date, but I would basically run around the department and interview some of my colleagues for a sort of 15-minute magazine podcast. A nice bit of music at the beginning. I think it went down quite well, but just keeping it up to date was a bit of a workload issue, which again is, I suppose, one of the disadvantages of all of this. But it makes it much easier to be topical because in the last 2 or 3 years, above all, I seem to find it been sort of a boon for teaching the subject because almost every week I lecture in the autumn, there seems to be a new issue that comes up which taps directly into the course. Things like the Cabinet Manual coming along, the Scottish referendum, the Judicial Review consultation paper, to name but a few, again, can direct the students rapidly into the debate through links on the website. And then, of course, we've got blogs. I did have a PowerPoint presentation which direct to Mark Elliott's blog, for instance, and the UK Constitution blog we've already heard reference to. Yes, you have to be selective as to which ones that you use, but I do think it's a very good way to start the debate. And almost invariably, there's nothing new. Well, it's just a new twist to a very old story. So the next logical step is thereafter to connect to the academic journals on the issue, which is quite easily done again because, once more, everything's electronic nowadays. We've used a number of other things as well. We've tried. It doesn't always have to be cutting-edge modern material. We've got links to various debates on Radio 4, a Neil Ferguson lecture, Russell Brand on the Select Committee. I don't know why we chose Russell Brand, but I guess we were trying to be populist. We've got Ilamfe, a clip from Ilamfe up there, a Reef lecture. So we did think about having a public law film club with Yes Minister and West Wing and possibly Scandal and stuff. But we ran out of time. We haven't quite got to that level yet. I haven't experimented with Twitter yet, but I think we probably will next year. So if anyone's got any ideas on that, I'd love to know. Colleague of mine actually assessed by way of a wiki page. The students were actually, their coursework was to develop a wiki page. Then, of course, there's the discussion board facility, which works sometimes very well, sometimes not. Just to abuse my position, the multiple choice thing. We've for a number of years had a multiple choice test at Sheffield. We have now dropped it for one reason or other, but we actually had negative marking, which made it great fun. So we did get 2 or 3 students every year who got 20 out of 20, but we also, I think our best was -3. But it certainly stretched the marks. It certainly stretched the marks. There's probably other things I could talk about that, but that's I think probably my time done.
Well, thank you to everybody for keeping so well to time. And now, unless anybody wants to comment on what the people after them have said, I will now throw it all open to the floor.
Fiona raised the issue, are problem questions useful? And I think this is quite a good question. From the experience of our course, where we teach Public Law 1 in one semester for 10 weeks, then Public Law 2 Administrative Law for 10 weeks, we have the obligatory problem question on the exam paper, but very few students do it. And in all honesty, and I think we'd agree on this, we don't put enough effort into preparing students adequately for problem questions. And when they do it, sometimes they go completely way off the line. And I think there is a legitimate issue there about how good problem questions are. And I'd invite other people to share experiences about just how critical is the problem question, because it's just judicial review. Albeit an important area of law, but what are we trying to get out of students, to prepare them for problem questions? So I'd like to hear from other people on that.
Can I just, because I had a very interesting experience this year. Obviously it's a I teach a specifically judicial review one semester course, and I run 3 tutorial cycles largely to deal with problem questions to prepare them for the exam. And I told them this, and I said, obviously problem questions, you've done problem questions in other subjects. In judicial review, they're particularly difficult. They're very long and convoluted questions often. So the tutorials will be there to guide you through the process and take you through past exams. First tutorial cycle, most of them turned up, but with no preparation. Me being grumpy, I went into the next lecture and said, well, this is unacceptable. If you're not going to do the work, don't go to the tutorial. Obviously, I put that in completely the wrong way, because what happened at the next tutorial cycle is that they didn't go to the tutorial. Rather than actually do the work, or at least some of the work, they made a conscious choice simply not to engage with the tutorial at all. With the result that on the exam, it wasn't compulsory to do a problem question, and most of them had taken on board my comments that it's very, very difficult. So therefore, they just they topic spotted for the essays and spotted the essays and answered those. So I'm now, this is why I'm particularly interested in raising this question, because I'm torn between having a compulsory problem question and making them go through the pain, or just kind of finding other ways to explore the skills and the development of kind of what we're looking for in the problem questions in a different way. And the last thing I want to say on this is that I think there is a real problem in all problem questions, but particularly in judicial review, that we tend to kind of box off the topic. So you have a problem question on natural justice, and you have a problem question on control of discretionary power, which is completely artificial. And you have to say at the end of the problem question, ignore any issues in relation to the other area in discussing this. So that in itself, I think, illustrates some of the limitations, which is why then I'm interested in this question of, if I can find another way of doing it, I quite happily never write another problem question in judicial review again, because that's also very painful.
Okay, I've got a queue of people. So Mark, Javier, David, and Richard.
So we use problem questions quite a lot at Cambridge. You may have seen it, our criminal law problem question this year was reported around the world. And certainly in public law, we set problem questions occasionally, even on things like the entrenchment of legislation and so on. There were 2 things I wanted to say. The first is just a sort of a response to Fiona, which is that I almost see the advantage of problem questions as being that you can set a question that is not boxed in and which ranges across the syllabus. And so one of the things that I think our students dislike about problem questions in administrative law, and one of the reasons that I like them, is that they can't question spot, and that you will have a question that involves unreasonableness, natural justice and standing, for example. So I don't see that there's a problem with them having to focus on a single topic. I think that the wider question, and one that I mentioned because we've just completed a major curriculum review, is that to a large extent, whether you use problem questions or not, has to do with what it is you want the students to demonstrate, and how in the first place, therefore, you want to teach the subject. Students will invariably have an opportunity to display a different kind of grasp of the subject if you set a problem question than if you set an essay question. If what essentially you're trying to teach is a course in constitutional theory, then presumably the role of problem questions is quite limited. If it's a course which places more emphasis on technical knowledge and a grasp of doctrine, then there's a greater role for it. So I think that this question about assessment and about the kinds of questions that we use is keyed into some very fundamental prior questions about what is it we're trying to get the students to do and to actually understand.
Thank you very much, all members of the panel, for an extremely interesting discussion. I don't know if any of the speakers had anything to add to, because I'm going to ask slightly unrelated questions now. Before I start, yeah.
We following actually on from Mark's point, we dropped problem questions at UEA because we decided that they were probably better taught. This is less from a doctrinal point than from a skills-based point. We decided they were better taught in criminal law and other subjects throughout the first year than landing them on students for a month or 6 weeks in the spring. So we decided that, sorry to be sort of very pedagogical about, that the aims and objectives of the module did not include application of law to hypothetical facts. It was discussing, arguing, construct, etc., etc. And that's what we decided the module was going to be about. And so we just eliminated it from the course.
So we went down the opposite direction. Advised the Prime Minister on a certain problem scenario regarding whether ministerial responsibility. Advised the Minister on introducing a bit of legislation which is obviously raises human rights implications in the EU. I mean, we do that a lot. You make the problem question compulsory, and yes, you've got to design your teaching. Good point, though, that David makes. We do have to spend quite a lot of time trying to teach the stuff. But I think it fits into the skills agenda, the employability agenda, which the powers that be are banging on to us all the time. So, we go for the problem question model.
Can I just say one more thing? Sorry. One thing I'm going to try next year, and I was discussing with a colleague of mine who now works in Australia, is that in a tutorial, what I'm going to do, and I'm going to try and make sure that they come to the tutorial, is split the group in half, and each half is going to set a problem question for the other half. So they actually have to write the problem question themselves, or it'll be a short one, and then they'll swap them over and answer. So they actually go through the advantage of the problem question then is getting them to think about the contested issues and areas where perhaps there are questions and limits or kind of wriggle room within the law, and then swap them over and they can kind of try and construct the answers through. So even if you remove it from the exam, you can still, I think, integrate it into the kind of teaching method. And it's kind of quite interesting.
If I may now, I really appreciate all your advice about answering problem questions, addressing problem questions, because as Robert has said, well, maybe it's my fault. I've been in charge of this part of the course in public law too, but it's a very difficult area, and students seem to initially prefer essay questions over problem questions on the overwhelming majority of occasions. Then all this advice is extremely invaluable, and I appreciate it. I wanted to raise two other aspects here. Fiona, in your presentation, you referred to the question, to the methods of assessment. And if I recollect properly, you said that exams are preferred by us as academics because they make things easier, perhaps. Our task or maybe I interpret it this way. I was wondering if you could discuss a little bit the alternative to traditional methods of exam and the relationship between coursework and exams, and what is, at the end of the day, what is better for us is probably not that important, but what is best for our students in order to assess them fairly and rightly. And then if you and other members of the panel could tell us a little bit about formative and summative assessment and how you approach it, I would appreciate it. And finally, if I may, this is honestly, I promise, is the final point. Topicality, Mark, I thought that was extremely interesting. As an academic who has taught, I regard myself as a domestic lawyer, but I've taught EU law for a good number, or I taught EU law for a few years when I first arrived in the UK. And I think it's extremely challenging for us, and not underestimating for 1 second the difficulties ahead of us, public lawyers. But teaching EU law, you have to face a significant reluctance on the part of the students to start with. Then having taught public law for a few years, I think it's slightly easier. I'm not saying it's easy, but you mentioned something really interesting. You said the topicality is important, but we have to limit it at times. We have to reduce. I was wondering if you could explore that a bit further. Thank you.
It may be that we don't prefer exams. I think a variety is important. I certainly come from an institutional perspective now that creates limitations on what we can do. We're kind of semi-semesterized, which means that we are modularized, but the institution itself has not gone down the route. We can't actually run exams at Christmas time, even though we do have modules within the first semester. The only way you can do it is by having in-class tests, which you have to run yourself, which you get no administrative support for. So there's a tendency in which all the exams then are pushed at the end of the second term. So that's just a practical dynamic. Now, that's supposed to be changing, but Irish institutions take time to change, and Cork in particular, so we'll see how that goes. My concern about large amounts of assessed work is, as I say, this kind of, you can get very top-heavy, or very, sorry, not top-heavy, but very, it can become squished into short periods of time for the students, and they can really become overwhelmed by assessed work. We have to, I think it's really important that we remember as academics that we don't, our courses are important, but students take a variety and multiple courses. Often, certainly for us, we have students who are taking other subjects, so language or commerce or something like that. So you have to actually have that discussion with your colleagues as to how they're being assessed, when they're being assessed, and you have to also think about overall skills assessment as well. I think that has to be integrated into what kind of assessments each course does. So it's bigger than just public law, and I know that's, we're just looking at public law here, but I don't think you can have that discussion about assessment solely within your particular subject. It has to be looked at wider than that. The other thing that I think is very relevant, and I'm looking at this in relation to criminal law at the moment, is what the professions want, and in terms of the exams, in terms of professional exams. And subjects which are core modules, which are preparatory for the professions, there is a tendency for us to say we'll stick with the exams because that's how they're going to be assessed when it comes to the professional exams as well. And for criminal law, for example, we are going to stick with pretty much 100% exam, because when they go off and do their bar exams or their, kind of their legal profession exams, that's what they're going to be faced with too. So it is partly that preparation for beyond the law degree. But I know we have to balance that in terms of their general education too. So I don't actually have a clear answer. I think we do need to have a variety, but I think there's a real danger, and I've seen it certainly in our master's degrees, there's a real danger in just going down the road of assessed work, chucking out the exams and thinking this is the right way to assess them. And our students in our master's degrees are literally overwhelmed by the number of assessed pieces of work. It's actually become counterproductive, that they don't have enough time in the term to do their work, to fully integrate their learning and their understanding, and then do their assessments. They're overwhelmed. So I think exams can be very useful, and they have very good assessment methods to them. We've done them for years for a good reason, but I don't think we should just solely rely on them.
Yes, on the left there.
Thanks very much. So it relates to the last point, I guess, about assessment, but also on the difference between formative and summative. Because I thought the idea of writing the problem question in a group and then giving it to the other group is a really good good idea for running a tutorial. I was wondering to what extent you think it's also a good idea in an exam. That is to say, so what we do is as part of the assessment, sort of a 10% part, we do group presentations on the House of Lords reform. So we don't teach that otherwise, but we get them to do it as a group. And so that involves arguably two skills. So one is working as a group and the other is oral skills or presentation skills. And so I wonder if people have any thoughts on whether these two are good things to assess.
Yes, I do. Certainly, yes, the two of them. The caveat I would offer, we had this discussion at UEA a couple of years ago when we had a curriculum change, was my worry, as wearing my other hat as Director of Learning and Teaching, of assessing things that we don't actually teach. And I have a particular worry about assessing group work when we just assume people will work in groups. And in fact, what we did, because we were moving a little bit more towards that sort of thing, is we did into one of our first year core modules introduce some work on teamwork, group working, etc. I mean, it was at a very basic level. There was not an awful lot of sort of theoretical stuff and management stuff in it, but it was at least some discussion about how group dynamics works. I mean, I would just offer that as a general point on assessment. I think, you know, wearing a different hat, the worry of assessing things that we don't teach. Hence my trying to do these skills type things. I think we assume an awful lot of students, and also assume perhaps, I think, Robert, the point that you made about problems, you know, we assume, this is not that other people will pick these things up, and there needs to be, following on from Fiona's point, a bit more talking between modules within a year than simply teach. You know, it's a curriculum, it's not a series of atomised modules, so that people do either reinforce in other modules or pick up things that aren't taken. So that's not a teaching public law point. That seems to me a general, you know, teaching sort of point. And I can perhaps build on this very, very quickly about formative work. I mean, I floated at UEA, but it's never really been adopted, the idea that not everybody in the first year needs to write a long essay for 4 modules before Christmas and in the spring, creating a massive amount of work for everybody. You know, if what you're trying to get them to do is to write an essay, you could divvy up, you know, can you write a good introduction? Can you do a plan? Can you analyse a case within the middle of an essay? And those would be much shorter pieces of work, reducing the workload for everybody, but all of it contributing to the skill of writing an essay or problem solving. But that would involve an awful lot of talking to others. And the worry we'd had expressed by students on that is, but I want to be able to write an essay in constitutional law. I can write an essay in criminal law, but I want to be able to write one in constitutional law. And you think, well, all you've got to do is know different things. I mean, an essay is an essay is an essay. So we've had a bit of a stumbling block with the student body over that plan.
Yeah. Mark.
I was just going to answer the other question that Javier asked earlier, which was about sort of limiting topicality, and so I suppose what I had in mind is that, you know, when I mark students' essays, one of the things that I often tell them is that, as well as knowing what to put in, you have to know what to leave out as well. And certainly as a teacher, I think as I've gained more experience over a period of years, I've come to appreciate that in terms of teaching as well. I think there's always the inclination to put down on the reading list the latest development, the latest case, the latest you know, slight modification to this or that. And I mean, that's certainly a conscious decision that Robert and I made when we did our book together, is that of course we wanted to paint an accurate picture of the British Constitution, but that what we really wanted students to get out of this was an understanding of the fundamental principles and of the context within which those principles operate and apply. And so I guess what I'm arguing is that we should sort of de-fetishize the latest developments for their own sake, but that we should embrace and celebrate topicality to the extent that it can shine a light on the really fundamental issues that we want the students to grapple with.
Yes. Can I? Oh, sorry.
Sorry.
Right.
Being happy. This would be my last point.
Yes.
In terms of variety of assessments, I mean, it's whether anyone in the room has tried open book exams, takeaway exams, pre-release exams. I've tried an open book exam in my final year human rights course, and it proved to be very successful. I mean, it just removes the level of learning that students have, and unless one of your aims and objectives is to be able to remember an awful lot of things, it seems to me you're assessing something that, I know views differ on this, but that is perhaps not the greatest of skills. And I've found it I think the students have found it extremely useful, that they've removed that element of knowing an awful lot of stuff and can actually use it better in the exam. That's just a thought rather than that.
Well, I was about to avail myself of the privilege of the chair to make one point, and now, if provided nobody minds, make two. The problem I find with open book exams is that quite a lot of students, in my experience, are tempted simply to write chunks from the statute book, which is why I haven't allowed students to take statute books into most of my exams. And also, unless you make it completely open book, i.e. they can take absolutely anything in, then you have the problem of policing what they're allowed to take and what not.
No, this is absolutely open book. They can take in
anything.
whatever they like.
Right, so that's something to throw out. And just on the subject of assessments, one of the things we started doing with the Plymouth GDL about 4 years ago now is that instead of having a coursework for each of the 7 core modules, we have 3 courseworks, each covering 2 modules, and EU law, which is the odd one, is 100% exam. So public law is paired with criminal law, and we have done, over the years, we have done some essays and some problem questions, and what we found is that a public order scenario lends itself quite well to a problem. That you can do a public order scenario incorporating both basically police powers in relation to public order, bit of human rights, and various criminal offences into that quite easily. Our latest one was, in fact, involved a celebrity and somebody going through her dustbin, and it was privacy and various offences involving raiding people's dustbins, phone hacking, and obviously the question of rights to privacy, particularly under the European Convention. That worked quite well. Setting essays has, funnily enough, been a bit more difficult. But it's very easy, obviously, to set a public law essay question, essentially saying, well, does the present state of public order law find a proper balance between protecting the right to protest and also preserving public order? But it's rather more difficult to bring in a criminal angle as well. So that is just a summary of experience. Yes, David.
David Feldman. That's prompted a number of probably unrelated thoughts. One is that if you want to set an all-purpose essay question that you can apply to any subject at all, it is what question would you have most liked to see on this paper and why? I highly recommend it. But the second thing I was going to say was about open book exams, and I was surprised to hear that from Fiona, I think, that students felt they didn't have to know a lot of stuff if they had open book exams, or was it David? They didn't have to learn it. Yes, and that puzzles me greatly, because unless you're giving them an infinite amount of time to write their answers, the idea of going into an exam with an unlimited amount of material and looking at the question and then trying to go through the material to find something that might help you to answer it is really scary. And my impression of people who do well in open book exams is that they actually know a heck of a lot. And what the open book allows them to do, first of all, is to check very detailed matters, and they have to know the stuff very well to know where to look for those very detailed points, and also know it well enough to know that there are those detailed points that need to be checked. And secondly, it offers them a comfort blanket. And we could offer them all a comfort blanket, I suppose. But I don't think it saves people from having to learn stuff. The question that I was going to ask is that a lot of the discussion seems to be premised on the idea that the people who are teaching and examining these courses are, at least substantially, public lawyers. It seems to me that looking around the country and talking to people, anecdotally, a lot of the people teaching subjects, at least in small group settings, aren't public lawyers. They're people who are coming in from just about any angle. And I noted Fiona's point right at the beginning that we're not a typical group, and she said that we were people who probably loved the subject when we studied it. Now, I have sympathy with these others because I hated the subject when I studied it. It was my worst subject. I got my lowest mark of any subject I ever did in constitutional law, and the reason that I started teaching it was that my first dean, Professor Pettit, a very fine equity lawyer, said when I took up my first post, "You will be teaching public law, jurisprudence, tax, and English legal system." So I did. And over time, I found public law less ghastly when I was inflicting it on others than when I was having it inflicted on me. So the question, coming to the question at last is, what do you think are the implications of the non-specialist teaching group for the way we teach and the way we assess?
Right.
Shall I have a go at that one? Well, I hope at least the person who's coordinating it has some vague interest in public law, and I think that's got to be part of the answer. So then, I guess if you really are down to a teaching team of non-experts, you've got to really design those seminars in a kind of a very sort of student-driven way to get round the obviously lack of compensating input from the seminar leader. Would be my. And just to chip in on the last one, I think I've made a note here that I'm actually now in favour, from what David said, of not an open book exam, but I think we've had an interim this year, but certainly a pre-release question. Just because I think it allows you to ask a more difficult question. You're more legitimately able to ask a more difficult question, which generally gets a more interesting answer than the dull, safe question.
Right. Yes, on my right.
It was just Richard Kirkham, Northumberland University. It was just a comment really on this rather than a question as such. Because it's the Legal Education Training Review final report just out today, and one of the recommendations on that is for increased standardised assessments across the board. So I just thought it was worth mentioning as a comment, as a kind of footnote to this. This is going to be on the agenda for everybody, and not just public law, so more of this is going to be on the cards.
Did I say what would be standardised? What would be the standard?
Just in more standardised assessments across the board, just in the headlines. Haven't had a chance yet to digest it all. Obviously, I've been elsewhere, but that's more.
Yes.
Neville Harris at University of Manchester. Just want to come back on the open book exam issue, just to say that I used an open book exam in education law for the first time this year, and I think it's very important to prepare students for doing an open book exam. because absolutely right, they have very little time in the exam. They've got 45 minutes to answer a question. They haven't got time to read and write their answer at the same time. They can't do it, and they haven't got enough time to read. And so you've got to prepare them in advance. And I tried to get them thinking about the materials they were bringing into the exam as just a prompt. An aide-memoire, yes, but they need to know the subject. They need to know the layout of the subject. They need to understand what they're looking for. I entirely agree with what David was saying about that. And discourage them from, in fact, incorporating statutory references in great profusion in their answer. They will not get rewarded for that. But I would like to say that you shouldn't really set questions that require students to set out lengthy statutory extracts in their answer. Really, I don't think there's the sort of questions we should be setting, certainly in more specialist options. That's all I want to say.
Can I just? My reply may have been a bit glib on and I agree entirely with both of you. And I did try and prepare my students in exactly that way and suggest that a couple of sheets of paper with key quotations, data or statistics or what you have to know the material, but you've just got a couple of sheets there that you and the best ones. I remember from a handful of years ago when the ID cards bill was still going through Parliament, I set a question on it, and one student produced a sort of an 85, and because they had got a lot of material. The classwork had been to go through Hansard, and they'd extracted quotations and data and statistics that they would never have been able to learn, and put this into a most fantastic answer on should we or should we not have introduced ID cards. So, yeah.
And just to say that it worked out very well. I mean, the answers were very good, and they did, I think, for the most part, follow my advice about using the material sensibly. So it was a positive, and I think the overall results were better. But I'd need to run it for a few more years so that a pattern emerges, because obviously it might just have been a good year.
Okay, and next to you, you're going to have to be the last one, I'm afraid.
Thank you. To come back to that point about standardisation and experimentation, I thought I'd just share a little experiment that I've tried in assessment. This is not in the full-scale public law, but it's in an option, and it's now in the final year, and it's in administrative justice. And at the start of the module, when we have lectures but not tutorials, I require the students to go to a social security tribunal and visit it, so that they observe that for a morning or an afternoon. And then I thought, you should write something about it. That was formative work. And then this year, for the first time, I turned it into 1,000 words of a piece of summative work for 10%. But what I did was to give them a prop that they had a couple of articles that they were then meant to relate their experience of what they saw with the theoretical literature. And that seemed to work quite well. It also helped that they did do it very well. I was using step marking, so I was able to go up into the 80s and the 90s. But because it's only for 10%, it's not really skewing. But it does seem, it's also partially, I think, a little bit of research, sort of toe dipping into doing a bit of qualitative research. So it seemed to tick an awful lot of boxes, and certainly the reaction of the students to it was very favourable.
Yes. Well, regrettably, I'm going to have to draw this discussion to an end, because I think the next thing on the programme is tea, which obviously has greater priority even than discussion, though of course we can carry on discussion over tea. So I've had a wonderfully interesting time chairing a panel of people who obviously know their subjects extremely well, and hope the standard of discussion will continue in the final panel this afternoon. And I must, of course, thank Javier for all his hard work organising this, and Robert as well. And may I mention Maureen, who seems to have sent me lots of emails, but it's all worked extremely smoothly. So, tea.